Good evening, everybody. I want to welcome you to what I think is a really important conversation with former Senator Jen Metzger. I want to thank the Climate Reality Project, New Yorkers for Clean Power, Riverkeeper, Hudson Sloop Clearwater, the New York League of Conservation Voters, Scenic Hudson, and Partners for Climate Action, as well as our friends at Radio Kingston who are live streaming this right now, and all of our friends and allies who've kind of helped get the word out about this. Senator Metzger is doing something absolutely Herculean in trying to distill down over 800 pages of content and appendices in the CLCPA scoping report. So we may go a little bit long, and we probably won't have time for questions because there's a huge amount of content, which I just want to thank Senator Metzger for wading her way through and helping the rest of us wade our way through. So without further ado, former Senator Jen Metzger.
Thanks so much, Tim. Hi, everyone. It's so great of you all to take time on this glorious Saturday afternoon. I'm going to share my screen. And I do want to say, because it's running so long, I do want to try to answer your questions. And but what we'll do is, I'll give you and share an email that you can send questions to, and we'll try to answer them afterward. So we'll start sharing the screen. All right. And I want to thank again all the organizations that are partnered in tonight's dive into the state's proposed climate plan, that's known as the Scoping Plan, and to Jimmy Buff and Radio Kingston for streaming it. When I was in the state Senate, I was very involved in our climate law and efforts to get it passed. And I've been following the process to implement that law since its passage as closely as I can, because it's this process that will determine to an important degree whether and to the extent we'll meet our climate goals. I think it's also a really exciting collective endeavor for our state and our communities that can change our economy, our health, and our quality of life in important ways, in addition to all the climate benefits. The purpose of this presentation is really to just introduce you to the plan, to encourage you to dig into it and discuss its recommendations with your family, friends, communities, networks, and make your voices heard during the public comment process, which is happening right now, and not enough people know about it. The scoping plan is of monumental importance to New York's efforts to address the climate crisis, and it's going to require the engagement and support of New Yorkers to succeed. I will warn you that I'm covering a lot of ground squeezed into probably just over an hour, but we'll share the slides with you so that you can look at them at your leisure. And again, as I said, try to answer questions that you have. So basically what we're covering today is, I'm going to start by putting the plan in context and give you a sense of this planning process and the timeline, and then just kind of set the context for this scoping plan by looking at where we are in New York State in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions, where we need to be, the scale of change that has to occur, the benefits of those changes. And then we're going to look at the scoping plan recommendations in 4 areas: in buildings, transportation, electricity, and waste. There are other topics, many other topics covered in this plan. We can't cover the whole thing. I will also discuss, though, how you can all weigh in. This is my big caveat slide. We're not covering every single recommendation because it is a huge plan. The scoping plan itself is 330 pages, and it has 500 plus pages of appendices. So What is the drought scoping plan? First of all, basic question. It's the state's action plan for reaching the goals of the 2019 Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which is one of the strongest and most forward-looking climate laws in the country. The law requires that New York reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030 below 1990 levels and achieve net zero emissions by 2050. It also calls for generating 70%, requires that we generate 70% of our electricity from renewable resources by 2030 and achieve a carbon-free, fossil-free electricity system by 2040. And super importantly, we have to do this in a way that ensures a just and equitable transition. And the law requires that we dedicate 35 to 40%, should really be 40%, of the benefits of clean energy investments to disadvantaged communities. So, why is the scoping plan important? Well, we can't reach our climate goals without it, for starters. It's also important to recognize that the plan is meant to shape state legislation, state regulation, state spending, and the policies and programs of every state agency and department in the coming years, putting New York on a road to a healthier, more sustainable, more equitable economy. So just to give you a kind of quick overview of the process. So the climate law established a Climate Action Council to develop this plan. The council is co-chaired by the DEC Commissioner Basil Sagos and the NYSERDA President Doreen Harris. It has 22 members. 12 of them are the heads of all of the relevant state departments and agencies, and another 10 members were appointed, 4 by the Senate, 4 by the Assembly, and 2 by the governor. And the appointed members are primarily a mix of environmental and justice advocates, climate justice advocates, industry representatives, and scientists. And you can see the full membership on the state's the Climate Action Council's website, and I'll be talking about that, sharing that link throughout. So the climate law also called for specific expert panels and working groups to inform the council's deliberations, and the scoping plan that we're talking about today reflects their contributions to a great degree. This includes 7 advisory panels that had expertise and involvement in all of the issues related to emissions, from transportation, industry, agriculture, forestry, housing, land use, local government, and waste. It also reflects the contributions of the Climate Justice Working Group, which is representatives from environmental justice communities statewide and representatives from the DEC, Health and Labor Departments, and NYSERDA. The Climate Justice Working Group is responsible under the law for defining the criteria for disadvantaged communities. As I mentioned, they are to be the disadvantaged communities are the recipients of up to 40% of the benefits of clean energy investments, but also this plan is really about making sure that we are prioritizing disadvantaged communities in all divisions. So the working group also provided input into plan recommendations. And finally, a Just Transition Working Group also contributed to this process. That working group focuses on workforce development and training opportunities and mitigating the impacts on workers and communities in affected industries like fossil fuels. So between March 2020 and December 2021, the Climate Action Council and all these bodies were meeting like a lot all the time. There were over 100 public meetings. They were all public. They're all recorded. You could watch every one of them if you wanted to online. So this gives you a sense of the timing of the whole process. The Climate Action Council, approved the draft plan for public comment at the end of December. And right now we're in the red bar, the public comment period, which is required to be at least 120 days. That would run us through the end of April, unless it's extended further. The council is required to hold 6 public hearings, 3 upstate and 3 downstate. And those have not been scheduled yet, but we're hoping they will be scheduled soon. And when they do, we hope you sign up. So after the public comment period, the Climate Action Council has a year to kind of take in that public comment and finalize the report, finalize the scoping plan before it has to be delivered to the legislature and the governor in July 2023. So I just wanted to sort of start out and, give us a sense of where we are. The climate law requires that the Department of Environmental Conservation annually produce a report on the state's greenhouse gas emissions, and actually requires a far more comprehensive accounting of those emissions than does other states. It includes, for instance, upstream emissions from fossil fuel imports. So when you're cooking on your gas stove, it's not just the methane emissions from the stove that's counted in this inventory. It's also the emissions from the fracking of the gas in Pennsylvania. This framework also takes into account a 20-year global warming potential to better account for the huge near-term impacts of methane emissions. So I know these numbers are like kind of hard to wrap your head around, but I just want you to see how far we have to go in less than 3 decades, from about 380 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent to just over 60 tons in 2050. And then those 60 tons to be net zero, those 60 tons have to be sequestered, preferably naturally in our lands, to be net zero. So this lovely pie chart shows you where all of our emissions are coming from. Buildings are the leading source of emissions at 32%. Transportation is a close second, followed by electricity, 13%, and waste, and then industry and agriculture. So a really comprehensive analysis was undertaken for the Climate Action Council. It's called the integration analysis, and it assessed how far all of the initial recommendations of the various advisory panels would take us in reaching the state's emissions goals. And the short answer is not quite far enough. So this integration analysis looked at alternative scenarios, and the recommendations were further revised to better align with our emissions targets. I had a few slides on that. I had to take it out, but I do suggest you take a look at the summary of that analysis in the scoping plan, and it's also attached as an appendix to that plan, Appendix G. But the analysis provided some really eye-opening findings on what it will take to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero. And I wanted to share some of them with you just to give you a sense of the changes. First of all, you'll be glad to know that reaching those targets is technically feasible, according to this analysis, but it is going to require very high levels of transformation in every sector. By 2030, for instance, we need to electrify 1 to 2 million homes with heat pumps. We need to replace 3 million gas vehicles on the road with EVs. The solutions in buildings and transportation are they're electricity-based solutions. So this is going to have a big impact on electricity consumption, which will nearly double by 2050. Peak load will nearly double. By 2035, the electricity system will be what's called a winter peaking system. The periods of highest electricity use will be in the winter when we're all running heat pumps on the coldest days. Although ground source heat pumps or geothermal are much more efficient and can help lower that winter peak. And then the last bullet there in the waste sector, by 2030, all organic waste, which is a big source of methane emissions, will need to be diverted from landfills, right? Composted or biodigestion. So now you're probably thinking, oh my God, what is this all going to cost for these transformative changes in our economy? The integration analysis had some surprising findings. The analysis took into account the savings from avoided health costs. There are a lot of savings because we're greatly improving local air quality when we reduce emissions. So, and it also took it, so these are health savings. It also took into account the avoided damages from climate change. And what the analysis found was that the cost of just continuing on the course we are significantly greater than taking the necessary actions we need to take to decarbonize the economy. So inaction would cost about $90 billion more than taking action. Of course, taking into account avoided climate damages assumes other governments will also reduce their emissions. Another interesting finding, the net costs are quite small relative to the size of New York's economy. And that's because we would be replacing most of the equipment and goods we need to replace anyway. When our boilers and furnaces kick, when it's time to buy a new car, it's about making the right choices for those replacements when it's time to replace them. My gas dryer of like, I think it was like 20 years old or something like that, or more actually, just died recently, replaced it with a heat pump dryer, and it's great. So there are just a huge health benefits to achieving emissions reductions. As the report mentions, air quality improvements can avoid tens of thousands of premature deaths, thousands of non-fatal heart attacks, thousands of other hospitalizations, thousands of asthma-related emergency room visits, and hundreds of thousands of lost work days. There was also a job study done as part of this process by the Just Transition Working Group, and the job benefits and impacts are huge. The statewide net gain of jobs is almost 190,000 by 2030 if we implement the changes we need to make, and 268,000 jobs by 2050. And the largest wage increase is in the middle wage positions, $28 to $37 an hour. So that's like bucking the trend of the last 50 years of a declining middle class. The sectors that, so basically the ratio of jobs gained to jobs displaced is about 10 to 1. But of course, it's not to minimize those jobs that are displaced. And a big focus of the climate law was to make sure that we have the policies and programs in place to support workers and their families, to provide a safety net, and to ensure that the training and resources is in place to transition into occupations in clean energy industries. So now we move on to recommendations. These 4 sectors count for about 85% of New York's emissions: buildings, transportation, electricity, and waste. So buildings are by far the largest source, as I mentioned, of emissions. The emissions are mainly from combusting fossil fuels in our homes and buildings for heating and hot water. It is an incredibly challenging sector to reduce emissions. There are over 6 million buildings in New York, and most of them were built before there were any energy codes. So it's not just about electrification, it's also about weatherization and improving efficiency. And we face a major affordability challenge. 48% of households in New York are low and moderate income. NYSERDA estimated that it'll cost about $1 billion annually to make the improvements that need to be made in low and moderate income housing. Current state and utility annual spending is at $250 million. So, we're only about a quarter of the way there. But there are huge health benefits to making those improvements. And there was an analysis of this done as well as part of the Climate Action Council's work. There's an estimated $9 billion in savings and health benefits from just making improvements to low-income housing. And that's an underestimate because it doesn't take into account the health benefits of switching away from gas stoves, which we're learning are really not good for your health. This just gives you a sense of, where these emissions are coming from. The bar on the far left, you can see the emissions are mostly from the residential sector. It's mostly from the combustion of utility gas, though there's still a lot of households, especially in our area, more upstate, that still use heating oil. And as I said, the end use primarily it's for this combustion of fossil fuels is for heating and hot water. So I think some of the strongest recommendations in this plan are on reducing emissions from buildings, which is a good thing because it's the biggest source of emissions. I'm just going to highlight a few of these on the slide. The plan calls for new construction of all residential buildings under 5 stories to be all electric by 2024. No more boilers, no more furnaces in new buildings and in new residential buildings. And by 2027, all new construction, including commercial and residential buildings over 4 stories, would have to follow suit. All electric, no fossil. This is an important recommendation. It's feasible, it's cost effective, and new construction is really the low hanging fruit. It also is pretty well aligned with the law recently passed in New York City, effectively prohibiting fossil fuel in new construction. There are some differences, but overall, it's the same 2024, 2027 timeline. So that's new construction. For existing buildings, the scoping plan recommends that by 2030, zero emission standards should be put in place for end of life replacement of fossil fuel equipment, with a 2035 date for large multifamily and commercial properties. Also by 2035, there would be zero emission standards for replacing gas appliances like stoves and dryers. So just to be clear, these standards would not require you to replace a working system. The idea is, eventually when your boiler goes after 2030, at that point, you'll change over to a heat pump system. So as we transition to electric technologies, we have to be transitioning off utility gas, which is what most New Yorkers use. This is a complex undertaking because it's tied into a wider utility gas system. So the shift has to be carefully coordinated, and it can't increase the burden on low and middle income households, moderate income households. It's very important. And the Climate Justice Working Group has recommended prioritizing disadvantaged communities in this transition. It's important because their health has been disproportionately harmed by co-pollutants from fossil fuels. The scoping plan makes clear that this transition has to happen very carefully, but it also has to happen as quickly as possible. The scoping plan recommends that a couple of things happen ASAP. Very importantly, the laws that govern utility gas and electric service have to be made consistent with our climate goals. Right now, those laws require utilities to expand gas service to anyone who newly requests it, and also requires ratepayers to subsidize that gas expansion if it's within 100 feet of a service line. So this has to be fixed. We can't transition away from gas as effectively if we're also expanding it. Another kind of ASAP recommendation, NYSERDA and the utilities have to stop promoting gas, and utilities in particular have to do a much better job explaining and promoting the benefits of heat pumps. The plan also makes recommendations around the gas planning process to transition off of fossil fuels, and recommends that the DEC develop emissions reduction targets for gas infrastructure to help guide utilities' gas system planning. So I was asked to give a kind of take action list in this presentation. So after each section, I'll have a slide that looks like this with some suggestions for public comment. On buildings, I think it's really important to express support for the timeframes for getting off of fossil fuels in new construction, and also the recommended timeframes for zero emission standards for replacement of equipment at the end of their useful life. These are, realistic timeframes that will put us on the path to reducing emissions from buildings, and they'll create healthier homes, schools, and workplaces for New Yorkers. It's not great to be combusting fossil fuels in your homes and buildings. So another important recommendation that would be great to support and public comment is aligning public service law with the climate law, and in it, requiring the Public Service Commission to initiate a managed equitable transition off of gas. There's actually a really good bill that's been introduced in the Senate by Senator Krueger and Assemblywoman Fahey, S8198. That would really kind of provides the fix that we need in that law, and it would be a great law to cite. And of course, no more fossil fuel infrastructure expansion. I think that should be really clear in the plan, and there needs to be sufficient dedicated funding to support an affordable transition for low and moderate income households at a level of $1 billion a year as recommended. Okay, now we motor on to transportation, or ride our bike there. So the share of New York emissions from transportation is 28%. As I mentioned earlier, to reach our climate targets, we need 3 million zero emissions vehicles on the road by 2030, also 10 million by 2050. I just want to compare that, share how that compares to now. I mean, it's a huge increase. There are 9 million registered light duty vehicles in New York, and we only have 45,000 zero emissions vehicles on the road. So, that is a fairly transformative change over this decade. And there are other challenges to decarbonizing transportation. Many areas of the state are underserved by public transportation. Traditional local land use patterns have encouraged sprawl, so we always have to get into our car and drive to the store rather than walk, or work, school. And changes in commerce, like just-in-time delivery, dispersion of production, has also made the delivery of goods much more inefficient. This bar just on the left shows you that most of the emissions, transportation emissions, actually are coming from cars and light duty trucks. So the scoping plan focuses on 3 main strategies for reducing emissions from transportation: electrification, expansion and improvement of public transportation, and promoting smart growth and mobility-oriented development strategies that make public transportation and low and no carbon transportation easier and more accessible. These strategies have multiple benefits for us beyond reducing emissions. Diesel fuel school buses subject our kids to harmful emissions, which often leak into the cabin of the bus itself. Outdoor air quality improvements from the elimination of tailpipe emissions are huge, especially for disadvantaged communities whose communities tend to be, housing is much closer to, often much closer to polluting transportation infrastructure like highways and bus depots. Investments in public transportation specifically can widen access to educational and job opportunities and to healthcare for those New Yorkers without reliable transportation. There are a lot of folks that can't afford a car to maintain a car. And encouraging development patterns that make walking and cycling a viable and safe way to get around is great for people's health and quality of life. So there are lots of other benefits to making these changes. So we're going to start talking about electrification, the recommendations around electrification, but I just want to first mention that some really important steps were taken a couple months ago. In December, the governor signed into law legislation requiring sales and leases of all new light-duty vehicles and off-road vehicles to be zero emissions by 2035. And by the way, GM had already committed to that that same target date for only selling zero emission electric vehicles, and the automotive companies are all really moving in that direction. Around the same time that bill was signed, the DEC finalized the advanced truck rule requiring new sales and leases of medium and heavy duty vehicles to be zero emissions by 2045. So these actions align New York's emission standards with California's and are as strong as they can possibly be under federal preemption laws. I also wanted to mention that last month, Governor Hochul committed to all school buses being electric by 2035. School buses last on average like 12 to 15 years. So this time frame basically allows replacement at end of useful life. There's a great piece of legislation introduced by my former colleague, Senator Kennedy, that would provide incentives to schools to accelerate electrification and help get that done even earlier. So, as I've mentioned, we need these 3 million zero emissions vehicles on the road by 2030. So the $1 million question is, how do we encourage 3 million vehicle owners to switch to zero emissions EVs by 2030 when the law requiring zero emission sales doesn't kick in until 2035? EVs are more expensive than gas cars and are not expected to reach purchase price parity until later in the decade. So that means that incentives have to be good enough to make up the difference. The scoping plan recommends, and there are already incentives in place, but they don't make up the difference. The scoping plan recommends a fee bait. This would be an additional fee on the purchase of fossil cars to pay incentives for electric vehicles. The Climate Action Council has called for structuring this fee bait in a way that doesn't create a disproportionate burden for low and moderate income customers. I also think it's really important to incentivize used EVs because a lot of people don't buy new cars, they buy used cars. Another scoping plan recommendation is to allow direct sales of EVs by EV manufacturers, which is currently prohibited under state law. There was an interesting article in the Atlantic recently comparing EV uptake in New York and Florida. In Florida, the state has done nothing to incentivize electric vehicles, unlike here. But Floridians have bought 60% more EVs than New Yorkers have. And a key difference is that they can go to an EV company's dealership, look at a car, test drive it, and then buy it if they like it, which New Yorkers can't do very easily. So, changing that law might inspire existing local dealerships to sell more EVs as well. Other electrification recommendations in the scoping plan include expanding state-funded charging infrastructure. This is, of course, hugely important. There's actually federal funding also coming for this. It's just announced recently by the Biden administration. Amending building codes to require new buildings to be EV ready. Most charging is done at home. Lead by example. The state should commit to 100% zero emissions passenger fleet by 2035. That's a recommendation of the scoping plan. And other recommendations of the plan focus on, utility rates and making sure that those rates are incentivizing off-peak charging and not disincentivizing or discouraging EVs for commercial fleets and public charging, which is what's happening because of onerous demand charges. Okay, moving on to public transportation. This section was a little underwhelming, I have to say. The strategies included community-based service enhancements, which basically means communities have to figure out what kind of enhancements they need to make. I think it's really important for counties with municipal bus systems, the users in our communities who use the municipal bus systems to weigh in on the recommendations in this plan and let the council know what the needs are. It's really, really important. There are also recommendations to just make public transportation easier to use by employing technologies, to make it easier to pay, to make it easier to navigate on your phone. Certainly improving convenience will make it public trans a more attractive option. The plan would also have the state work with municipal transportation systems to electrify at defined replacement schedules. My county, Ulster, is already has a project underway to electrify some of these buses. Of course, municipal systems will have to have resources to make this happen, both for electric buses and for charging infrastructure. There is state funding available, but it's right now for this, but it's mostly for the 5 big major cities in New York. And the scoping plan doesn't really have a clear, there's a list of possible funding options, but not really a clear pathway recommended for funding these investments. The plan also does not say much about expanding non-MTA transportation systems and improving intra-regional transportation. And I think these are important issues for people upstate to weigh in on. Okay, the third transportation strategy put forward in the plan is to promote smart growth and mobility-oriented development strategies. The recommendations here include tax incentives to businesses to support low carbon commuting solutions for employees. Interestingly, telecommuting is not discussed that I could see. That's like a zero carbon solution that many businesses have had to implement during this pandemic, and one that many employees may like to have the option to continue. Other recommendations focus on making sure that the state economic development grants align with these strategies. The state gives out a lot of economic development funding, and that agency decision making is also focused on expanding low and zero carbon solutions. Anyone who's tried to work with DOT on getting like crosswalks in your town knows that this is like really not the current mindset of the department. So this would be a sea change. All right, we come to the Make Your Voice Heard page. Here are some, suggested, points, recommendations that to consider for public comments. Requiring this progressively structured fee base is really the only way to make EVs more attractive in the marketplace right now until cost parity is achieved. It's an important recommendation and should apply also to used vehicles. Another incentive would be to eliminate the sales tax for new and used EVs. I had actually sponsored a bill to do that with Pat Pahey when I was in the Senate, and that bill is still around, and I can't remember who sponsored it, but that would also help bring down the cost. Also to enable direct sales. I think it would be good if we moved up the proposed target for zero emission state passenger fleets to 2030, since that is the year by which we have to electrify so many new cars. Other recommendations that are good to speak to are accelerating state-supported fast charger infrastructure build out, fixing utility rates to encourage EV uptake and off-peak charging, developing a strategy to support expansion of non-MTA public transportation, and require not just state, but IDA development funding to align with emissions reduction strategies, including mobility-oriented development. But county IDAs give away a ton of tax breaks to businesses, and it's really important that all economic development funding be aligned with these goals. I think it's also, as I mentioned earlier, important to share public transportation and needs and priorities in your area. Okay, moving on to electricity. Maybe we should only just stretch at our computer for a moment. Electricity accounts for 13% of our emissions, but keep in mind that we will be electrifying transportation and buildings to replace fossil fuels. So our electricity usage is going to increase a great deal, and we have to make sure that we're building enough renewables and storage to meet this demand. Now, we already have a clean energy standard in place, and as required by the climate law, the Public Service Commission has revised that standard to align it with our target of generating 70% of our electricity from renewable sources by 2030. What the Clean Energy Standard does is it requires utilities and energy providers to procure increasing amounts of renewable energy over time until we hit our targets. Of course, those renewables have to get built, and we'll come to that in a moment. It's also important to note that because wind and solar are intermittent resources, the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow, we'll need to greatly expand storage capacity, both to meet short duration needs, like when everyone's using power at home after work and school, after the sun goes down, and also long duration storage that can be used, for instance, in a bitter cold week in the winter when we're all running heat pumps at full tilt. So this is what our electricity mix looks like now. Our reliance on fossil fuels statewide has actually increased a few percentage points since 2019 with the closure of Indian Point. The vast majority of renewables now on the grid are hydro facilities that we've had a long time. Only about 5% of power currently comes from wind and solar. There are, however, a lot of projects that have already been contracted by the state, including 4.3 gigawatts of offshore wind. And if you include all of the contracted resources, we would actually be at 50%, 50% renewable generation. So we're heading in the right direction, but again, those projects have to be built. So this graph just is from the integration analysis. It gives you an idea of how our grid will have to change over time to be fossil free. The dark gray bar is fossil, which is gone by 2040. And you can see that by 2050, our grid is running primarily on, actually by 2040, on wind and solar. Existing nuclear, that's the kind of the grayish or taupe block on along the bottom, is it's you can see that it's existing nuclear is part of the energy mix, and at least in this graph till 2050. But I want to note that one of the scoping plan recommendations is to evaluate this decade whether it's necessary for baseload and reliability needs to continue subsidizing that existing nuclear energy. This is a set of recommendations from the in the scoping plan, to expand renewables. One of the top ones is to require the Office of Renewable Siting, or ORES, which is the office responsible for permitting large-scale renewables, to set metrics or goals for megawatts of renewables to be permitted each year through 2030 to keep us on track. And again, getting like projects actually built, not just contracted, but actually built. Another recommendation, which I'm very excited about, is to really incentivize and develop a robust agrivoltaics program in New York. That's integrating energy and agricultural land uses. It could be for livestock grazing. It could be growing crops, between rows of panels, but it's a way to really, maximize the productivity of the land for both energy and food production. Other recommendations focus on, getting utilities to be more supportive of getting new renewables onto the local grid, speeding up interconnection, expanding the capacity to host those projects. Other recommendations include targeting state incentives to promote, really high value renewable projects, more renewable projects in disadvantaged communities, more renewable projects serving multifamily housing, more projects that integrate agricultural uses, more projects that encourage rooftop and parking lot solar paired with storage, the kinds of projects that, our communities would really like to see. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of these recommendations, but, and again, we'll be sharing the slides, but I want to note that there is a real focus in the scoping plan on building community support for and acceptance of renewable projects. There has been a lot of opposition locally especially to large scale projects, but also to ground mounted, community renewable projects. And it's really critical that communities are partners in the transition to a carbon-free electricity system. So, there's recommendations for expanding the benefits to communities that host these projects, doing much more education and outreach on climate and the benefits of a clean energy economy. But it's important for the public, for our communities to really think about, what would best support renewable development, what would be best for our communities, and weigh in on that and comment. Storage and reliability are important issues, as I've discussed. The panel recommends that the Public Service Commission start a proceeding this year to consider binding storage, battery storage targets and a funding mechanism. So to make sure that we're increasing the amount of storage on our grid to support a renewable grid. There's also a focus on solutions to reduce peak demand, and there's also recommendations for really prioritizing research on long duration storage. There is no, I want to note, I've actually been asked a lot about green hydrogen, and there's what the scoping plan says about green hydrogen. There's no endorsement of specific technologies like green hydrogen or RNG for the electricity sector, but it does leave the door open to possible use of this technology after 2040 if it's needed for grid reliability. But the priority of the scoping plan is really on building out renewables and storage. Okay, so this is another take action page. It would be slide. It would be recommendations that I think are important are setting annual megawatt targets for state permitting of renewables so that we can make sure we stay on track to meet our goals. But I also think it's important to have megawatt targets to expand rooftop and parking lot solar and siting on brownfields, and develop a plan to reach those targets so that we have a real balance in our mix of resources. There should, as the plan recommends, be a priority focus on ramping up renewables and battery storage, and not false solutions like green hydrogen and RNG, which are the solutions promoted by the fossil fuel industry because it maintains it, they want to hold onto their infrastructure. It's also important to really prioritize those high value types of community value types of projects that I had mentioned earlier, electrifying low-income housing, expanding, combining that with solar, expanding opportunities for low-income participation in community renewables, incentivizing and supporting agrivoltaics. And there needs to be a major focus on statewide on education and public information around climate, renewable energy, and jobs training opportunities. It's also would be, I think, really important, as I mentioned earlier, to share your ideas for how renewable energy can be better supported in your community. The Climate Action Council really needs to hear directly from communities on this. So as we transition to a carbon-free grid, we not only have to ramp up renewable development, but also ramp down fossil generation. There are approximately 150 existing fossil generating facilities in the state. The scoping plan calls for developing a time frame of targets to reduce emissions from existing generation down to zero, and for the DEC to promulgate regulations to meet those targets. With regard to new infrastructure, it was interesting to watch the discussions of the power generation panel. Essentially, a majority of them favored a moratorium, but a minority of members, the industry members, opposed it. And since the Climate Action Council only adopted advisory panel recommendations that were approved by consensus, the moratorium didn't make it into the recommendations, but it's certainly something you can weigh in on. Okay, make your voices heard slide. So on fossil fuel, transition away from fossil fuels, no new fossil fuel infrastructure, it really does take us backwards. And I think that needs to be clear in our plan. It's important, I think, to support the plan's recommendation for a process to set targets for reducing fossil fuel generation emissions. The scoping plan also makes some other recommendations that I think, it would be beneficial to elevate in public comments, including ensuring fossil plants disproportionately harming disadvantaged communities close first, ensure adequate funding for localities affected by plant closure, tax revenue and jobs, and it has real impacts on communities that have to be mitigated. Ensure plant owner responsibility for site remediation. Communities should not be stuck with that. Incentivize and prioritize reuse of sites for battery storage if the community supports it. These sites are already ready for, to interconnect to the grid, and it would be a great way to continue, to ensure that that location continues to generate revenues locally, tax revenues. All right, quickly, waste. We're almost out of time. So waste accounts for about 12% of New York's emissions. The emissions are mainly of methane, which is a hugely potent greenhouse gas. Most of it is coming from landfills, 78%, but 15% of it comes from wastewater treatment plants. But direct emissions from disposal are only a part of kind of the picture. As the scoping plan notes, the most significant emissions impacts come, not from disposal, but from producing products and packaging. An eye-opening study came out recently from Beyond Plastics showing that greenhouse gas emissions from the US plastics industry is on track to surpass coal by 2030. This plastics is the fossil fuel industry's like plan B to survive the shift away from fossil fuel energy uses, and single-use plastics are just, it's a huge, huge problem. So this, the pie graph on the left shows you, where our waste end up. Landfills is the big one, 40%. Export, we export 27% of our waste, and we're sending our waste largely to poor countries and communities. So it's a huge environmental justice issue. 15% of it is combusted, again, largely in disadvantaged communities, which suffer the health consequences of this highly polluting process. So, they're going to, again, huge health and climate justice benefits to, addressing these waste issues. All right, I'm going to skip over to the recommendations, just in the interest of time. So for organics waste, the plan recommends that that we first strengthen the food donation and food scraps recycling law, and set targets and timetables to eliminate combustion and landfilling of organics. We passed this law, the food donation, food scraps, and recycling law, when I was in the Senate. It requires large food waste generators, so institutions, businesses that generate 2 tons of waste a week or more, to donate the edible portion of the waste and recycle the inedible portion of the waste if it's within 25 miles of an organics recycling facility. That 2-ton threshold has to be reduced to get more organics out of the landfill. Neighboring Massachusetts has for some time had a threshold of 1 ton of waste per week, and they're ratcheting it down even further. So New York can do it too. The Climate Justice Working Group has called for beefing up requirements for transferring excess edible food to local food banks. Other important recommendations: the state has to expand local financial assistance for organic recycling infrastructure, and expand successful models of organics collection programs, including to multifamily and public housing. The plan recommends a number of policies that, if put in place, would have an enormous impact on waste reduction and promoting a more circular economy. Requiring the products be made with a minimum level of recycled content, expanding our current container deposit program, enacting legislation to reduce and eventually phase out single-use packaging. If we are to tackle our waste problem in earnest, these are the kinds of solutions we need. And it would be good to elevate them in public comments and let the council know if you support them. Okay, so we have managed to get through 4 emission sectors in this report. I've tried to squeeze in the last hour, sorry, in the scoping plan. So congratulations for making it this far. I know it's a lot of information. I just want to make note of other issue areas we didn't cover. Agriculture and forestry account for a comparatively small share of emissions, but they do have a big impact on keeping carbon emissions out of the atmosphere, sequestering carbon in natural working lands and in woods, in wood products. So, policies around agriculture and forestry can have a really important impact on our ability to be, reach that net zero target. And that is true also of land use policies. They will greatly impact our ability to sequester emissions in our natural and working lands. So this topic deserves like a whole separate webinar, basically. But just so everyone's clear, when we say net zero by 2050, like getting to net zero carbon emissions, that's 85% reduction in emissions, and then that remaining 15% has to be sequestered somehow, in our forests, in our lands, etc., are the preferable way to do that. And finally, we didn't cover emissions from industry, which accounts for 9% of emissions. I do want to note that the scoping plan only makes a brief reference to highly energy intensive cryptocurrency mining operations, and there are no policy recommendations offered to address the climate impacts of that industry, which I think is a real gap that should be closed. Just quickly, economy-wide strategies for reducing emissions. The scoping plan actually is like seeking public input on strategies to internalize the costs of greenhouse gas emissions. It could be either economy-wide or in specific sectors like transportation and electricity. For instance, in the electricity, we have the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is a cap and invest program. I'm not going to go over these slides. I'm just going to share them with you so you can familiarize yourself with the issues. And definitely, I suggest really digging into them. This also could be a separate webinar, or should be. But it's important to provide input. And just like one kind of final, observation about the scoping plan, many initiatives are going to require funding. And a funding mechanism has been proposed. I've discussed some of those, but many others, that's not the case. And the funding question is really important because it's going to take resources to ensure a clean energy transition that's equitable and affordable for all New Yorkers. So the final plan is really going to have a clear strategy for how we're going to, raise the necessary revenues to make these investments, which are going to, we're going to see huge positive returns on them, but they have to be made. So your input on this question is important. Public input. The law really, when we passed the law, we really envisioned strong public input in this process. I am, as I said at the beginning, concerned that there hasn't been like a lot of outreach yet. I think it's hopefully coming about the fact that the comment period is open. But it is open. It has been open since the beginning of January, and it will go through April at the very least. And I encourage you to both sign up to speak at a public hearing, and also to submit written comments. So you can find everything you need on the Climate Action Council website. It's climate.ny.gov. The draft scoping plan and appendices are there. The recordings of all Climate Action Council meetings, advisory panels, and working group meetings are there if you really want to dig in deep. And all of the additional studies and reports that inform deliberations. And there's also a link for submitting comments right on the website. And I strongly urge you to share your comments with your elected representatives. One, because a number of the recommendations in this plan will require legislative changes. So it's important that they know, where you stand on those issues. But also, actually, some actions are being considered right now. Some have been proposed in the governor's executive budget in the building decarbonization area that are very relevant to this plan. And so it's important to be timely, and share your views with your representatives. And spread the word in your communities and networks to get involved. This is a one-time opportunity to weigh in on creating a plan for New York that is like sustainable and equitable, and could be a real model for other states and the country. Don't be daunted by the scale of change, because we have seen really big changes happen at scale in the past fairly quickly. We are out of time, but I do want to say you can, if you have questions, you can email us at info at info at nyforcleanpower.org. That's New Yorkers for Clean Power. I'm a senior policy advisor to that great organization. So that's again info at nyforcleanpower.org. With any questions you have, we'll also be sharing the slides. One other resource, a great resource that New Yorkers for Clean Power has is a green the grid presentation that various members of the team will present in your communities, and it can be a kind of a helpful presentation to share as you're talking about these recommendations in your communities. So I want to thank you all, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend. And I can't wait to see all the great comments that come in on the scoping plan. Let's do it. Thanks so much.